Greed, fundamentally, is an intense and insatiable desire to acquire more resources, wealth, power, or status than one actually needs. Psychologically, greed is not merely about wanting more. It is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon that involves cognitive, emotional, and social dimensions working in tandem. Unlike healthy ambition, which drives purposeful growth and achievement, greed operates as a destructive force rooted in perpetual dissatisfaction and an overwhelming fear of loss or scarcity. Ambition can be defined as a goal-oriented, constructive motivation to improve oneself or one's circumstances, usually balanced with ethical considerations and social norms. Greed, on the other hand, disregards limits and often leads to behaviors characterized by selfishness, exploitation, and disregard for others' well-being. It is important to differentiate greed from related concepts such as avarice or simple materialism. While avarice focuses narrowly on material wealth accumulation, greed encompasses broader desires, including the excessive pursuit of social dominance, influence, and power. Psychologists recognize greed as a manifestation of unmet psychological needs, such as the need for security, validation, and control, which triggers compulsive striving to obtain more. This compulsive drive is often fueled by emotional factors like anxiety, insecurity, and low self-esteem, which push individuals into an endless cycle of craving and acquisition. Neuroscientific research further explains greed through the brain's reward circuitry. The neurotransmitter dopamine plays a crucial role by creating feelings of pleasure and satisfaction when obtaining desired rewards. However, this pleasure is typically fleeting, which can reinforce addictive patterns of behavior as the brain constantly seeks new stimuli to replicate the rewarding experience. This biological mechanism partially explains why greed can be so difficult to control or satisfy, as it taps into fundamental human reward systems. From a cognitive perspective, greed distorts decision-making processes. It fosters cognitive biases, such as overconfidence and the illusion of control, which can lead to risky or unethical choices. Socially, greed can be contagious and culturally reinforced in environments that prioritize competition, material success, and status over cooperation and altruism. Understanding greed through this psychological lens is critical not only to identifying the behavioral patterns and emotional triggers associated with it, but also to developing effective strategies for self-regulation, ethical behavior, and healthier interpersonal relationships. By recognizing greed as a complex interplay between innate brain functions, unmet psychological needs, and social influences, individuals and societies can begin to address its underlying causes and mitigate its negative consequences. Greed, as a psychological and social phenomenon, has been understood and interpreted in vastly different ways throughout history and across diverse cultures. From ancient civilizations to modern societies, greed has often been viewed through moral, religious, and philosophical lenses that shape its cultural meaning and expression. In many traditional cultures, greed is condemned as a fundamental vice or sin, seen as a destructive force that disrupts social harmony and personal virtue. For example, in Western thought influenced by Judeo-Christian values, greed is frequently described as one of the 7 deadly sins, symbolizing an insatiable hunger for material wealth and power that corrupts the soul and alienates individuals from community and spiritual fulfillment. Similarly, Eastern philosophies such as Buddhism and Confucianism regard greed as a root cause of suffering and imbalance, emphasizing moderation, self-restraint, and compassion as antidotes to the destructive impulses of greed. Historically, greed has also been contextualized in relation to economic systems and social structures. During the rise of mercantilism and capitalism in Europe, greed was paradoxically both criticized as immoral and simultaneously praised as a motivator for economic growth and innovation. This duality persists in contemporary culture, where greed can be glamorized as ambition and drive, especially in competitive capitalist societies, while still being morally condemned when it leads to corruption, exploitation, and inequality. Anthropological studies reveal that cultural norms and values heavily influence how greed is expressed and tolerated. In collectivist cultures, for example, overt displays of greed may be socially discouraged to maintain group cohesion, whereas in more individualistic societies, personal accumulation and self-interest are often normalized and even encouraged. Moreover, cultural narratives and myths about greed, ranging from cautionary tales like the Greek myth of King Midas to modern critiques of corporate greed, reflect deep-seated societal anxieties about the consequences of unchecked desire. These narratives shape collective attitudes and behavioral expectations, reinforcing cultural scripts that dictate when greed is perceived as acceptable ambition or condemned as harmful excess. Understanding greed through historical and cultural perspectives is essential to grasp how social environments and value systems impact individual and collective behaviors related to greed. It highlights that greed is not a fixed human trait, but a dynamic construct shaped by evolving cultural, economic, and moral frameworks. This insight is crucial for developing culturally sensitive approaches to managing greed's effects in a globalized world. Greed, at its core, is not merely a psychological or social construct, but deeply rooted in the biological and neurological processes of the human brain. Neuroscience research has revealed that greed engages specific brain regions associated with reward, motivation, and decision-making, primarily involving the neurotransmitters dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine, often referred to as the brain's pleasure chemical, plays a pivotal role in the reward system by generating feelings of satisfaction and reinforcing behaviors that lead to reward acquisition. When an individual experiences gain, whether material wealth, power, or social status, dopamine levels surge, creating a sense of pleasure that motivates repetitive pursuit of such rewards. This neurochemical feedback loop explains why greed can become compulsive and difficult to regulate, as the brain continually seeks the euphoric effects triggered by acquiring more. In contrast, serotonin acts as a modulator of mood and impulse control, often counterbalancing dopamine's excitatory effects. Low serotonin levels have been linked to increased impulsivity and risk-taking behaviors, factors that can exacerbate greedy tendencies by impairing self-regulation and ethical judgment. Functional brain imaging studies, such as fMRI and PET scans, have identified heightened activity in the nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area during acts of acquisition and reward anticipation, underscoring these regions' involvement in greed-driven behavior. Moreover, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functions like planning, impulse control, and moral reasoning, plays a critical role in regulating greed by mediating the balance between immediate reward and long-term consequences. Dysfunction or underactivation of this area can lead to poor self-control and excessive greed. Recent neuroscience research also highlights how social and environmental cues influence the biological basis of greed. For example, exposure to competitive environments or social comparison can amplify dopamine responses, intensifying the drive for more resources or status. Understanding the biological and neurological underpinnings of greed is essential for developing effective interventions, including pharmacological and behavioral therapies, to help individuals manage excessive greed and its negative social impacts. This scientific insight bridges psychology, biology, and social science, revealing greed as a complex interplay between brain chemistry, neural circuitry, and environmental factors. Greed can be understood through the lens of evolutionary psychology as an adaptive mechanism that historically enhanced human survival and reproductive success. From an evolutionary standpoint, the drive to acquire and hoard resources, whether food, shelter, or social influence, provided significant advantages in unpredictable and resource-scarce environments. This survival greed motivated early humans to secure necessary assets that ensured safety, improved mating opportunities, and increased the likelihood of passing genes to the next generation. In this context, greed was not merely a negative trait, but a functional behavior that contributed to the survival of individuals and groups. Evolutionary theories suggest that such behaviors became hardwired into the human brain through natural selection, as those who effectively accumulated and protected resources were more likely to thrive and reproduce. However, while greed may have been beneficial in ancestral environments, its expression in modern complex societies can lead to social dysfunction and conflict. The same survival-driven impulses that once ensured physical survival can become maladaptive in contemporary contexts, where excessive accumulation leads to inequality, social tension, and erosion of communal bonds. Psychologists and evolutionary biologists recognize that greed represents a double-edged sword. It is both a legacy of evolutionary success and a potential cause of social failure when unchecked. Greed's persistence highlights the tension between innate biological drives and the need for cultural and moral frameworks that regulate behavior for the common good. Understanding greed as an evolutionary adaptation allows us to appreciate its deep roots in human nature, while acknowledging the importance of social norms and conscious self-regulation to mitigate its harmful effects in today's world. Psychological theories offer profound insights into the complex nature of greed by exploring its roots in human motivation, unconscious drives, and learned behaviors. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs provides a foundational framework for understanding greed through the lens of human motivation. According to Maslow, individuals strive to fulfill a series of needs, beginning with physiological survival and advancing towards self-actualization. Greed can emerge when lower-level needs, such as safety, security, and belonging, remain unmet or are threatened, causing individuals to compulsively seek more resources or status as a means to fulfill these deficits. In some cases, greed reflects an excessive focus on esteem needs, where the accumulation of wealth or power becomes a way to gain respect, recognition, or social dominance. From a psychoanalytic perspective, Sigmund Freud conceptualized greed as a manifestation of unconscious drives rooted in the id, the primitive part of the psyche governed by instinctual desires. Freud posited that greed is linked to unconscious impulses for gratification and control, often emerging from unresolved internal conflicts and early childhood experiences. Greed, in this framework, functions as a defense mechanism to manage feelings of insecurity, anxiety, or lack by compulsively acquiring objects or status symbols. The ego and superego may struggle to regulate these impulses, resulting in internal tension between moral values and primal desires. This dynamic explains why greed can sometimes appear irrational or self-destructive, despite the individual's conscious awareness. Behavioral theories further complement these perspectives by examining how greed is learned and reinforced through conditioning and environmental influences. Operant conditioning explains greed as a behavior shaped by rewards and punishments. When acquiring more yields positive outcomes, such as social approval, financial gain, or emotional satisfaction, greedy behaviors are likely to be repeated and intensified. Social learning theory emphasizes the role of modeling, where individuals adopt greedy behaviors by observing influential figures or societal norms that glorify material success and competition. Cognitive behavioral frameworks highlight how cognitive distortions, such as entitlement or distorted beliefs about scarcity, fuel greed, and maladaptive decision-making. Together, these psychological theories underscore greed as a multifaceted phenomenon arising from fundamental human needs, unconscious motivations, and learned behavioral patterns, all of which interact to shape how greed manifests in individuals and societies. Personality traits play a crucial role in shaping individual tendencies toward greed, with psychological research consistently linking greed to specific personality dimensions, especially those within the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Narcissism, characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, entitlement, and a deep need for admiration, often fuels greed by driving individuals to relentlessly pursue wealth, status, and power as symbols of superiority. Machiavellianism, defined by manipulativeness, strategic calculation, and a focus on personal gain regardless of ethical considerations, predisposes individuals to exploit greedily in social and professional contexts to maximize their advantage. Psychopathy, marked by impulsivity, lack of empathy, and antisocial behavior, exacerbates greed through reckless pursuit of personal desires without regard for others, often leading to exploitative or harmful actions. Beyond the dark triad, the Big Five personality traits, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, also provide important insights into greed-related behaviors. Low agreeableness, which reflects antagonism and reduced empathy, correlates strongly with higher greed, as individuals are less concerned about the impact of their acquisitive behaviors on others. Low conscientiousness, indicating impulsivity and poor self-discipline, can further contribute to unchecked greedy actions. Conversely, high extroversion, associated with assertiveness and social dominance, may amplify greed when coupled with desires for status and influence. Neuroticism, linked to emotional instability and anxiety, can drive greed as a compensatory behavior to alleviate insecurities. Openness shows a less direct connection, but may influence greed through attitudes toward risk and novelty. The intersection of these personality traits helps explain why some individuals are more prone to greed than others, suggesting that greed is not merely situational, but rooted in enduring aspects of personality structure. Recognizing these links has important implications for psychological assessment, intervention, and understanding the ethical challenges posed by greed in personal and organizational contexts. By examining the relationship between personality and greed, psychologists can better predict, manage, and mitigate greed-driven behaviors that contribute to social and economic problems. Greed is deeply intertwined with emotional factors, particularly fear, anxiety, and insecurity, which often serve as powerful psychological drivers behind excessive desire and acquisitive behavior. Fear, especially the fear of scarcity or loss, creates a persistent sense of vulnerability that compels individuals to accumulate resources or wealth as a protective buffer against uncertainty. Anxiety exacerbates this effect by generating chronic stress about the future and one's ability to maintain or improve their status, leading to compulsive behaviors aimed at reducing these uncomfortable emotions. Insecurity, whether related to self-worth, social standing, or personal safety, fuels greed as individuals seek external validation and control through material possessions or power. This emotional landscape transforms greed from a mere pursuit of excess into a complex coping mechanism that attempts to soothe underlying psychological distress. Psychologists understand greed as a form of emotional compensation, where the acquisition of wealth, status, or influence temporarily alleviates feelings of emptiness, fear, or inadequacy. However, this relief is often short-lived, creating a cyclical pattern in which greed intensifies as individuals continually seek to fill an emotional void. The compulsive nature of greed driven by these emotions can disrupt rational decision-making and ethical behavior, as the urgent need to manage internal discomfort overrides considerations of fairness or long-term consequences. This dynamic is supported by studies linking emotional regulation difficulties with higher levels of greed and materialism. Recognizing greed as an emotional response highlights the importance of addressing underlying fears and anxieties in therapeutic interventions, rather than focusing solely on external behaviors. Understanding the emotional roots of greed also offers valuable insights into societal phenomena, such as consumerism and economic inequality, where collective fears about status and security drive widespread acquisitive behaviors. By integrating emotional awareness into psychological models of greed, researchers and clinicians can develop more effective strategies to help individuals achieve healthier emotional balance and reduce the harmful impact of greed on both personal well-being and social cohesion. Greed is profoundly shaped by social and environmental influences, with family dynamics, peer groups, and media exposure playing critical roles in how individuals develop and express greedy behaviors. From early childhood, family environments establish foundational values and attitudes toward material wealth, sharing, and competition. Children raised in households where resource scarcity, status competition, or material success are emphasized may internalize greed as a necessary strategy for survival or social advancement. Conversely, families that model generosity and cooperation tend to foster attitudes that counteract greed. Beyond the family, peer groups and broader social networks reinforce norms around consumption and acquisition, often amplifying greed through social comparison and the desire for acceptance or dominance within a community. The media and advertising industries intensify these social pressures by relentlessly promoting consumerism and linking happiness, success, and social status to the accumulation of goods and wealth. This constant exposure cultivates a cultural environment where greed is normalized and sometimes glamorized, encouraging individuals to aspire to ever higher levels of acquisition. The psychological impact of social status competition further fuels greed, as people strive not only to meet basic needs, but also to achieve symbolic capital that elevates their perceived rank in social hierarchies. Research in social psychology demonstrates that status anxiety and fear of social exclusion can trigger greed-driven behaviors, as individuals seek to secure their place and power within competitive social systems. Understanding greed within these social and environmental contexts reveals that it is not simply an individual flaw, but a product of complex interactions between personal psychology and external influences. Addressing greed effectively requires considering these factors: family background, peer influence, cultural narratives, and media messaging, and promoting social environments that value cooperation, fairness, and sustainable consumption. By recognizing the powerful role of social and environmental factors, psychologists and policymakers can better design interventions to mitigate greed's negative effects on individuals and society. Greed plays a pivotal role in economic behavior, and its examination through the lens of behavioral economics provides valuable insights that challenge traditional classical economic theories. Classical economics assumes that individuals act rationally to maximize utility and make decisions based on complete information. However, behavioral economics reveals that greed often drives irrational decisions fueled by cognitive biases and emotional influences. Greed can lead to overconsumption, speculative bubbles, and unethical financial practices as individuals pursue excessive personal gain beyond rational needs or societal welfare. This divergence highlights the limitations of classical models and underscores the importance of psychological factors in economic behavior. Cognitive biases significantly contribute to the manifestation of greed in economic decisions. Overconfidence bias causes individuals to overestimate their knowledge, control, and ability to predict market outcomes, which can result in risky investments and excessive accumulation driven by greedy optimism. Loss aversion, another key cognitive bias, makes people disproportionately fearful of losses relative to gains, prompting them to engage in greedy behaviors as a way to compensate for perceived threats to their wealth or status. This fear intensifies the drive to hoard resources and avoid giving up assets, even when it is economically irrational. Other biases, such as confirmation bias and herd behavior, further amplify greed by reinforcing existing beliefs and encouraging competitive accumulation. Behavioral economics thus frames greed not merely as a moral failing, but as a psychological phenomenon shaped by innate biases and emotional responses that affect financial decision-making. This perspective has critical implications for policymaking, financial regulation, and personal finance management, suggesting that interventions aimed at mitigating greed-related risks should address underlying cognitive distortions and promote greater awareness and self-control. Understanding the behavioral economics of greed enables a more realistic and nuanced approach to managing greed's impact on markets, organizations, and individuals. Greed plays a significant role in shaping consumer psychology, profoundly influencing buying behaviors and consumption patterns across diverse markets. At its core, greed drives consumers to seek more goods, services, and experiences than necessary, often fueled by an insatiable desire for status, pleasure, or self-identity. This excessive craving leads to impulsive purchases, brand loyalty driven by symbolic value, and the perpetuation of materialistic lifestyles. Psychological research shows that greed amplifies consumers' sensitivity to scarcity and exclusivity, making limited edition products and luxury brands particularly appealing as they symbolize social prestige and personal success. This heightened desire often overrides rational decision-making, pushing consumers toward overconsumption and financial overextension. Marketing and advertising industries expertly exploit greed by designing campaigns that tap into these psychological triggers. Advertisements frequently associate products with wealth, power, and happiness, creating emotional appeals that stimulate consumers' greed-driven aspirations. Branding strategies utilize social comparison and status signaling, encouraging consumers to purchase not just for utility, but to convey a certain image or identity. Marketers also leverage cognitive biases such as the fear of missing out, FOMO, and urgency, promoting limited-time offers and exclusive deals that intensify greed-induced buying impulses. This strategic manipulation heightens consumer demand and fosters a cycle of continuous consumption, often at the expense of long-term financial health and environmental sustainability. Understanding greed's impact on consumer psychology is critical for developing more ethical marketing practices and promoting conscious consumption. It also provides consumers with awareness to recognize when their purchasing decisions are driven by greed rather than genuine needs, helping to foster more balanced financial behaviors. By integrating psychological insights into consumer behavior, businesses, policymakers, and individuals can work towards mitigating the negative consequences of greed-fueled consumption in a consumer-driven economy. Greed profoundly impacts leadership and organizational behavior, often undermining ethical standards, decision-making, and long-term sustainability within companies and institutions. In the context of management and leadership, greed manifests as an insatiable desire for personal gain, power, or prestige, frequently leading to unethical conduct, exploitation of employees, and neglect of corporate social responsibility. Leaders driven by greed may prioritize short-term profits over stakeholder welfare, fostering toxic workplace cultures characterized by mistrust, manipulation, and unfair practices. This behavior not only damages organizational reputation, but also jeopardizes employee morale, innovation, and overall performance. Numerous high-profile corporate scandals illustrate the destructive consequences of greed in business leadership. Cases such as the Enron collapse, Volkswagen's emissions fraud, and Wells Fargo's unauthorized accounts scandal highlight how greed can motivate leaders and executives to engage in fraudulent activities, regulatory violations, and deceptive practices to inflate company value or personal wealth. These incidents reveal systemic failures in governance and ethical oversight, underscoring the critical need for transparency, accountability, and ethical leadership. The psychology of greed helps explain why some leaders succumb to these temptations, often fueled by narcissistic traits, unchecked ambition, and a culture that rewards aggressive risk-taking without adequate moral constraints. Understanding greed's role in organizational behavior is essential for designing effective corporate governance frameworks, leadership development programs, and ethical guidelines. By addressing greed through psychological insight and promoting values such as integrity, empathy, and social responsibility, organizations can mitigate risks, foster sustainable growth, and build trust among employees, customers, and society at large. This comprehensive approach ensures that leadership serves the collective good rather than narrow self-interest, ultimately contributing to healthier organizational ecosystems. Greed's dark side manifests through profound psychological and social consequences, often serving as a root cause of conflict, criminality, and corruption that disrupt both individual lives and broader communities. Psychologically, greed fosters an insatiable desire that drives individuals to prioritize self-interest at the expense of ethical standards and social norms. This relentless pursuit frequently leads to corrupt behaviors, including fraud, bribery, and embezzlement, which erode institutional trust and fuel systemic inequality. Socially, greed intensifies competition and conflict by exacerbating disparities in wealth and power, often resulting in social fragmentation, unrest, and diminished social cohesion. These dynamics perpetuate cycles of injustice where the greedy exploit vulnerable populations, widening gaps and undermining collective well-being. Beyond societal impacts, greed has severe psychological consequences that harm mental health and interpersonal relationships. Individuals consumed by greed often experience chronic stress, anxiety, and dissatisfaction, as their needs are never fully met. This emotional turmoil can lead to isolation, mistrust, and impaired social connections, damaging families, friendships, and professional relationships. Moreover, Greed-driven behaviors foster environments of deceit and exploitation, which further deteriorate interpersonal trust and cooperation. Research in psychology reveals that greed correlates with reduced empathy and increased narcissism, impairing emotional intelligence and the capacity for healthy social bonds. Understanding these negative outcomes underscores the importance of addressing greed not just as an economic or moral issue, but as a critical psychological challenge requiring interventions that promote empathy, ethical awareness, and social responsibility. By acknowledging the dark side of greed and its multifaceted consequences, individuals, organizations, and societies can better develop strategies to mitigate its harmful effects. These strategies include fostering ethical leadership, encouraging community engagement, and implementing mental health support systems that address the emotional drivers of greed. Such comprehensive approaches are essential to restoring trust, enhancing social harmony, and promoting psychological well-being in a world increasingly challenged by greed's pervasive influence. The psychological dynamics between greed and generosity represent a fundamental tug-of-war within human nature, reflecting opposing motivations that shape behavior and social interaction. Greed, characterized by an intense desire to accumulate more for oneself, stands in stark contrast to generosity, which involves selfless giving and concern for others' welfare. Numerous psychological studies highlight that these traits engage distinct cognitive and emotional processes. While greed activates reward circuits associated with self-benefit and acquisition, generosity engages neural pathways linked to empathy, social bonding, and moral satisfaction. This contrast underscores the duality in human motivation, where individuals continuously negotiate between self-interest and altruism. Several factors influence whether a person leans toward greed or generosity. Personality traits such as empathy, agreeableness, and moral identity play crucial roles in fostering generous behaviors, while traits linked to narcissism and the dark triad often correlate with higher greed. Environmental and social contexts, including cultural values, upbringing, and peer influence, significantly affect this balance by either reinforcing competitive accumulation or encouraging cooperative sharing. Additionally, situational factors such as perceived scarcity or abundance impact decision-making, with scarcity often triggering greedy responses and perceived abundance promoting generosity. Psychological research also reveals that emotional states, such as guilt, pride, or gratitude, can motivate generosity, whereas fear, insecurity, or envy tend to drive greed. Understanding the psychological interplay between greed and generosity is essential for promoting pro-social behavior and mitigating the negative effects of greed on society. Interventions aimed at enhancing empathy, ethical reflection, and social connectedness have proven effective in shifting individuals toward generosity. By fostering environments that reward altruistic behavior and model generosity, societies can counterbalance greed's detrimental influence and encourage a more cooperative and equitable social order. This nuanced understanding highlights that greed and generosity are not fixed traits, but dynamic tendencies shaped by complex internal and external factors. Greed and addiction share striking psychological and neurological parallels, often overlapping in their compulsive nature and impact on behavior, yet they also possess distinct characteristics that differentiate them. Both greed and addiction involve the brain's reward system, particularly the release of dopamine, which reinforces behaviors by generating pleasure and motivating repetition. In greed, the acquisition of resources, wealth, or status triggers dopamine surges that create temporary satisfaction, similar to the high experienced in addictive behaviors such as substance abuse or gambling. This neurochemical mechanism explains why greed can become compulsive, driving individuals to continuously seek more despite negative consequences. Like addiction, greed hijacks the brain's reward circuitry, leading to impaired self-control and persistent pursuit of gratification. However, there are key differences between greed and traditional addiction. While addiction typically involves physical dependence and withdrawal symptoms related to substances or behaviors, greed is primarily a psychological and behavioral compulsion without physiological withdrawal. Greed is often socially reinforced and normalized, especially in competitive environments that reward material success, whereas addiction is generally stigmatized and treated as a clinical disorder. Furthermore, greed's focus is on external accumulation and status, while addiction centers around the internal need to alleviate distress or achieve altered states of consciousness. Despite these differences, both share the challenge of breaking cycles of compulsive behavior that harm individuals and society. Understanding the neurobiological and psychological commonalities between greed and addiction provides valuable insight for developing effective interventions. Treatments that focus on enhancing impulse control, emotional regulation, and reward system balance, such as cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness, can be beneficial in addressing compulsive greed. Recognizing greed as a form of behavioral addiction reframes it as a mental health issue, opening pathways for therapeutic support and reducing moral judgment. This comprehensive approach facilitates healthier decision-making and promotes sustainable behaviors, ultimately mitigating the detrimental effects of greed on individuals and communities. Greed is a dynamic psychological phenomenon that develops and evolves throughout the human lifespan, influenced by early experiences, developmental stages, and changing social contexts. In childhood, greed often manifests as a natural expression of basic survival instincts and limited self-regulation, where children learn to assert control over resources such as toys, attention, and affection. Early family environments and parenting styles play a critical role in shaping attitudes toward sharing, generosity, and entitlement. Children raised in nurturing, secure environments are more likely to develop balanced views on resource acquisition, while those exposed to scarcity, neglect, or excessive material focus may internalize greed as a coping mechanism or learned behavior. As individuals progress through adolescence and adulthood, greed becomes more complex, intertwining with emerging identity, social status concerns, and cultural values. Peer influence, socioeconomic factors, and exposure to consumer culture intensify greed-driven behaviors, especially in competitive environments that emphasize achievement and wealth. Psychological development during these stages also affects impulse control and moral reasoning, which can either exacerbate or mitigate greed tendencies. For example, higher emotional intelligence and ethical awareness often correlate with reduced greed in adults. In older adulthood, greed may diminish due to shifting priorities, increased wisdom, and life reflection, though it can persist in some cases, particularly when influenced by fear of loss or insecurity about legacy. The cumulative impact of life experiences, social roles, and psychological growth shapes how greed is expressed or controlled over time. Understanding greed across the lifespan highlights the importance of early interventions, education, and supportive social environments in fostering healthy attitudes toward material desires and social cooperation. This lifespan perspective is vital for developing age-appropriate strategies to address greed's challenges, promoting psychological well-being and social harmony at every stage of life. The question of whether greed differs between men and women is a complex psychological inquiry that combines biological, social, and cultural factors. Psychological research has explored gender differences in greed, revealing nuanced findings that challenge common stereotypes. While some studies suggest that men tend to exhibit higher levels of greed, particularly in competitive and financial contexts, others find that these differences are small and heavily influenced by situational and cultural variables. Biological factors such as hormonal influences, testosterone in men and estrogen in women, may play a role in risk-taking and dominance behaviors associated with greed. But these effects are not deterministic and interact with environmental conditions. Social and cultural influences significantly shape how greed is expressed and perceived across genders. Traditional gender roles often encourage men to be assertive, competitive, and resource-driven, traits linked to greed, while women are socialized toward nurturing and cooperative behaviors that may suppress overt greedy tendencies. However, changing societal norms and increased gender equality have blurred these distinctions, with women increasingly participating in economic and leadership roles that demand ambition and resource acquisition. Moreover, cultural expectations can mask or amplify greed differently, making it essential to consider context when evaluating gendered behaviors. Importantly, gender differences in greed are not absolute, but part of a broader spectrum influenced by personality, values, and life experiences. Understanding these complexities helps dispel myths that oversimplify greed as inherently masculine or feminine. Instead, psychology emphasizes that greed is a human trait modulated by a web of biological predispositions and sociocultural factors affecting both men and women. This insight encourages more equitable and accurate perspectives on greed, informing research, policy, and interventions aimed at fostering ethical behavior and reducing greed's negative impacts regardless of gender. Greed fundamentally challenges the core principles of moral psychology, as it frequently conflicts with values of fairness, empathy, and social responsibility. At the heart of this tension lies the interaction between greed and an individual's ethical framework and conscience. Moral psychology examines how people develop and apply moral reasoning to navigate competing interests, and greed often triggers intense internal conflict when self-interest clashes with communal or ethical norms. This conflict manifests as cognitive dissonance, where individuals experience psychological discomfort from acting greedily while knowing it contradicts their moral beliefs. The struggle between desire and conscience reflects the complex negotiation between immediate gratification and long-term ethical considerations. Several moral theories provide insights into how greed is processed psychologically. Deontological ethics emphasize duties and rules, suggesting that greed violates fundamental moral imperatives, such as honesty and justice. Utilitarian perspectives weigh greed's consequences, often condemning it for generating harm, inequality, and social discord. Virtue ethics focus on character traits, highlighting greed as a vice that undermines virtues like generosity, temperance, and integrity. These frameworks explain why individuals may experience guilt, shame, or remorse when succumbing to greed, activating self-regulatory processes aimed at restoring moral balance. However, when these processes fail or are overridden by rationalizations, greed can lead to ethical erosion and antisocial behavior. Understanding the moral psychology of greed is essential for developing interventions that reinforce ethical awareness and promote conscience-driven decision-making. Techniques such as moral reflection, empathy training, and ethical leadership cultivation help individuals recognize and resolve internal conflicts caused by greed. Additionally, Fostering environments that reward moral behavior and hold individuals accountable can strengthen ethical standards and reduce greed-driven misconduct. This comprehensive approach bridges psychology, ethics, and social responsibility, providing pathways to mitigate greed's damaging effects while supporting moral development and social harmony. Effectively managing and overcoming greed requires a multifaceted approach that integrates cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness practices, and self-regulation techniques to address both the psychological roots and behavioral manifestations of greed. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, plays a pivotal role by helping individuals identify and challenge distorted thought patterns, such as entitlement, scarcity mindset, and entitlement, that fuel greed-driven behaviors. Through CBT, individuals learn to reframe their beliefs about material wealth and status, develop healthier coping mechanisms, and cultivate long-term goal setting that prioritizes ethical values over immediate gratification. This evidence-based intervention empowers people to gain insight into their impulses and make conscious decisions that reduce compulsive acquisitiveness. Mindfulness-based approaches further complement cognitive therapies by enhancing self-awareness and emotional regulation. Practicing mindfulness trains individuals to observe greedy thoughts and urges non-judgmentally, creating psychological distance that weakens automatic compulsions. This heightened awareness enables better control over impulses, reduces anxiety associated with scarcity fears, and fosters a greater appreciation for intrinsic values such as compassion, gratitude, and interconnectedness. Studies show that mindfulness interventions not only decrease materialistic desires, but also increase overall well-being and prosocial behavior, making it a powerful tool in combating greed's psychological grip. Self-regulation strategies, including goal setting, impulse control techniques, and ethical reflection, are critical components in maintaining sustainable behavioral change. Developing emotional intelligence and practicing delayed gratification support individuals in resisting short-term temptations in favor of long-term fulfillment and social harmony. Additionally, creating supportive environments that encourage transparency, accountability, and ethical leadership reinforces personal efforts to manage greed. Integrating these psychological and behavioral interventions offers a comprehensive framework for individuals and organizations seeking to overcome greed, promoting healthier decision-making, stronger relationships, and ethical integrity. Religion and spirituality have long played a significant role in addressing and mitigating greed, offering profound ethical frameworks and practical guidance to counteract this pervasive human tendency. Major world religions, including Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Judaism, consistently condemn greed as a destructive vice that disrupts moral harmony, social justice, and personal fulfillment. These spiritual traditions emphasize values such as compassion, generosity, humility, and detachment from material possessions as antidotes to greed. By framing greed as not only a personal flaw, but also a spiritual obstacle, religions encourage adherents to cultivate selflessness, ethical living, and community support, thereby promoting both individual well-being and social cohesion. Spiritual practices provide concrete tools for combating greed by fostering mindfulness, gratitude, and ethical reflection. Meditation, prayer, fasting, and acts of charity are common rituals that cultivate inner peace and reduce attachment to material wealth. These practices enhance self-awareness, helping individuals recognize the transient nature of possessions and the deeper sources of happiness beyond accumulation. Moreover, spiritual teachings encourage forgiveness, altruism, and service, which counteract the selfish impulses underlying greed. Research shows that people who engage regularly in spiritual or religious activities often report lower levels of materialism and greed, alongside higher life satisfaction and prosocial behavior. Integrating religion and spirituality into psychological and social interventions can offer a holistic approach to managing greed, addressing not only cognitive and emotional factors, but also the deeper existential and ethical dimensions. By reinforcing moral values and providing supportive communities, religion and spirituality help individuals transcend greed's limitations and contribute to a more compassionate and equitable society. This enduring role underscores the importance of faith-based perspectives in the ongoing effort to understand and reduce greed in a complex, modern world. In today's rapidly evolving digital and globalized world, greed has taken on new dimensions, influenced by technological advancements, social media, and shifting economic paradigms. The rise of instant gratification culture, facilitated by online shopping, cryptocurrency speculation, and social networking platforms, amplifies greed by constantly exposing individuals to endless opportunities for acquisition and social comparison. Globalization has intensified competition for resources and status, often magnifying inequalities and fueling greed-driven behaviors on both personal and institutional levels. Psychological research increasingly focuses on understanding how these modern factors interact with innate human tendencies toward greed, examining the impact of digital environments on impulse control, materialism, and social behavior. Future psychological research on greed aims to explore these emerging trends through multidisciplinary approaches, combining neuroscience, behavioral economics, and social psychology. Studies are investigating how virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and big data influence decision-making processes related to greed, as well as how online anonymity and reduced social accountability may exacerbate unethical greed-driven actions. Researchers also emphasize the importance of cultural sensitivity, recognizing that greed manifests differently across diverse societies affected by globalization. Furthermore, there is growing interest in developing innovative interventions that leverage technology, such as digital mindfulness apps and AI-driven behavioral nudges, to help individuals and organizations manage greed constructively. The social implications of unchecked greed in modern society are profound, potentially exacerbating wealth disparities, environmental degradation, and social polarization. Understanding and addressing greed through advanced psychological research is critical for shaping ethical policies, fostering sustainable consumption, and promoting social justice. As we look to the future, integrating cutting-edge scientific insights with cultural and ethical considerations will be essential in mitigating greed's negative impact, ensuring that technological progress benefits humanity as a whole rather than fueling destructive acquisitiveness. This evolving field holds promise for creating a more equitable and psychologically balanced global society.